All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar, Interoperability 101 for EdTech vendors. I'm excited to see the variety of folks that we have joining us in the chat. Please introduce yourself and where you're from if you haven't done so already. We are very excited to be offering this webinar, Project Unicorn, in collaboration with our colleagues at SIIA. Sarah, I see you there in the chat. Welcome. We're so glad that you could join us today. And we are very excited to have you with us. Chloe, can you move on to the agenda? Just to give you a brief overview, we will do a brief introduction to Project Unicorn, who we are, what we do, and how we can help you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about data interoperability in education. What are some of the common data standards, some helpful resources to help you move forward on your interoperability journey. And then we're going to give you opportunities to ask questions. So if during the webinar you have questions, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You'll see little conversation bubbles and the letters Q and A. So please be sure to add your questions there, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. And Chloe, can you move on to the next slide? Just want to introduce ourselves and our fabulous presenter today. So I'm Susan Bearden. I'm the Director of Digital Programs at Innovate EDU, which is the organization that organizes Project Unicorn. And I'm thrilled to have with me here Chloe Sanducci, who is our Program Manager with Project Unicorn. And she is leading our vendor engagement work. And I'm going to turn things over to her now so she can tell you a little bit more about interoperability and why it matters to our vendor community. So Chloe, take it away.
Thanks so much, Susan. I'm so excited to be here with everyone today. And before we get into interoperability and everything that we're going to discuss today, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what Project Unicorn is, if you don't know. So it's an initiative made by Innovate EDU, and it's a coalition of national education organizations. You can see all the different organizations listed here, and they're working collaboratively to promote and support the use of data interoperability standards in K-12, which we're going to define in just a moment. And this coalition and this project is funded by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we provide resources and support for school systems, states, and vendors, specifically referring to data interoperability, which I'm going to define. So interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. Interoperability can transform teaching and learning by giving teachers the information that they need to succeed and enable innovation in classroom practices to help guide students. So before we actually bring this into the education world and think of how this works in the education sector and the EdTech vendor sector, we can think of what data interoperability means as an analogy. So we're going to use an analogy of a lack of data interoperability or just interoperability standards. So let's consider these pictures here. We have Legos, we have Lincoln Logs, and Tinker Toys. So these can represent different types of data storage systems in our analogy. All three of these toys, they work really well within their own ecosystems. Legos work with Legos, Tinker Toys, they work with Tinker Toys, and Lincoln Logs work with other Lincoln Logs. But you'll run into trouble if you try to mix Legos and Lincoln Logs or Tinker Toys to build a house. They won't connect because they have the different pieces. So you might be able to make some custom built connectors with the help of something like a 3D printer that might allow you to use them together, but it would definitely be really expensive, complicated, inconvenient, and require a lot of technical skill. And there would be prone to more error and failure, and it really wouldn't be easily scalable. So this is much the same manner with data stored. While data may look the same in a user interface of an application, the manner in which it's stored in the backend can vary tremendously among systems. And this makes it really difficult to combine data from different sources and present or analyze it in a meaningful, easy, understandable way. So let's look at a few examples of what interoperability looks like in our everyday life and where we can see interoperability just in the things that we're using every day. So One example is Bluetooth, the headphones on the left side. So Bluetooth is a great example of some everyday interoperability. We're able to use Bluetooth with our headphones, our computers, our cars, and more. And with the Bluetooth technology standard, we're able to exchange data between multiple devices without any complication. Some other examples are Wi-Fi. So the Wi-Fi standard, this is why you don't need a special wireless card when you try to connect to a Wi-Fi in different areas or different places. And also an ATM, that's another interoperability within our everyday lives, thinking that we can take our debit card and use it in multiple different ATMs. So it's much the same when we consider this with different types of district level data storage systems like a student information system or an SIS, which you'll see a couple times on different slides, or a learning management system or an LMS that you'll also see on the slides. While data may look the same in the user interface of an application, the manner in which it's stored on the back end can vary tremendously among the different systems. And we're going to see an example in just a moment. And custom built connectors that you or the district might have created are undocumented, proprietary, and potentially risky to deploy. So this can make it really difficult to combine data from different sources and present or analyze it in a meaningful way. So let's look at an example of this problem. So what we see here is an example of why data interoperability can be important in education and where we see this problem rise. So we have 3 different EdTech tools. We have Kickboard, which is a behavioral merit dollar point system. You have Progress Book, which is a student information system. It collects things like student enrollment information, student demographics, graduation eligibility, scheduling. And then we have iReady, which is assessment data. So these 3 different EdTech tools, when we're looking at something like how they store their data, you can see here on this slide that the student identifying ID in each tool is different. And this makes it very difficult for the data to be shared with each other. For Progress Book, there's a Progress Book ID. They also have the state ID. Kickboard has its own ID and iReady has its own ID. There's also the issue where the names for some of the data fields are actually the same, but the way that it's stored is different. So you'll see first name is the same for all of these examples, but the way that the first name was stored was in 3 separate ways. So we have some issues where formats and fields are different, but also issues where the information entered is different. If you as the vendor and the tool are standards aligned, it makes it much of an easier process for schools to combine this data, and it helps them have better decision making and more success within the classroom. So why is data interoperability important? Well, states and districts, they're swimming in data that they really can't use. And this is due to data stored in siloed locations, as well as it's difficult to bring data from different sources together. And some challenges that we see that's caused by this lack of interoperability, we have educator and staff time spent manually downloading data and manipulating it into spreadsheets. Also, that time spent manually rostering EdTech tools. They're unable to see data from multiple sources, assessments in one place, as we talked about in the previous example. Some other issues, students have to leave LMSs and go to external websites to view digital learning content, and data that's being moved is in an unsecure and an unprotected manner. So in this next slide, you're actually going to see an example of what interoperability can look like at a district, at a school system, and with your EdTech product or tool being used in this manner. So this is an example of data flowing into an operational data store. Interoperable standards-aligned data systems store commonly defined data and make it easily available to users in an agreed-upon format. So data is stored using commonly defined standards. That means that the same thing, even when it's housed in different systems, they'll have the same way to speak to each other. And this allows school systems to easily combine the data from separate systems. So they can combine an SIS an LMS, the attendance data, the assessment data, all the data from the different systems, discipline, behavior, and then they can view and analyze it in one place. So it's about taking the previously siloed information and putting it into an operational data store. And this is just an example of what a district might want to do or want to be able to do with all of their data. You'll also see another example here. This is a different example of what a district might possibly want to do with their data. So in this example, you can see that these tools are integrating directly with a learning management system. So two separate examples. It's something to consider and to think about as we continue through this presentation and you start to think of where your product sits in the market and where it would be useful for a district. And before we get into the education data standards, we're just going to pause for a moment to talk about the State of the Sector report. So this is a report that was created by Project Unicorn, and it's an analysis of K-12 school capabilities and infrastructure for leveraging education data. So this report evaluates the responses from school systems across the United States, providing valuable insights into the state of K-12 data interoperability and suggestion action steps to move the work forward. You can use the QR code to check out the report and use the interactive dashboard, or you can go to this link. But as an EdTech vendor, this will be a very useful report to just see the state of where K-12 school systems are with interoperability and the things that they need to move forward. So we're now going to talk about the education data standards. So there are 4 major open education data standard organizations in the United States. And we're going to start with the Common Education Data Standards, or CEDS. So the field-driven, federally supported education data standard and management initiative, whose purpose is to streamline the understanding of data across P20 and workforce institutions and sectors. Other standards are based on the CEDS model or data model, and CEDS is largely used by states. And you can see some of the common uses. It's a data dictionary and common vocabulary and data models. The next standard that we're going to talk about, or the organization, is A4L, or Access for Learning Community. So it's good to know that A4L also hosts the Student Data Privacy Consortium. And A4L has standards that are used for rostering, state longitudinal data systems, student record exchange, and transcripts. The next education data standard organization that we'll talk about is One EdTech. So One EdTech has standards for K-12 and higher education, including rostering, comprehensive learner records, digital curriculum assessments, learning apps, learning platforms, and also One Roster, which is a very common use for rostering in K-12. And One Roster is a technical specification which allows for the exchange of roster data between LMS and SIS and learning tools. And one thing to note is that One EdTech was formerly known as IMS Global. And lastly, we have the EdFi Alliance as an education data standard. So this is widely adopted and CEDS aligned. It's an open source data standard developed by the educational community, used at both the district and state level. And it's mostly used for SIS, assessments, and state reporting. So now that we went over those 4 education data standards, you might be asking yourself the question, well, what standard should I integrate with as an EdTech vendor or as an EdTech tool? Well, the answer is that it depends. It depends on the use case. So you really want to think about, what does your product do and what data is being exchanged with your product. Some things that we can consider when deciding which education data standard to integrate with, you can think of what type of data do you collect. You can also think of what other systems might your tool interact with. Does it interact with an LMS? Does it interact with an SIS? Or Does it do state reporting? So those are just a few factors to consider. Before we jump into the Q&A, there's a couple of resources from Project Unicorn that we are going to throw into the chat, and something that you might want to just click the link and keep open for later use on your laptop or on your computer. So one resource, a great place to start, is the first 3 steps for EdTech startups. So this is a pretty quick, it's about 1 to 2 page document that will help you learn why data interoperability is so important in today's competitive market, and how you as an EdTech startup can make your market advantage. So I think that is being put into the chat. That's a great place to start if you need a few pointers of where to even begin. A few other resources that are helpful for the position that you might be in. There's a resource called Using Multiple Data Standards for Education Data Interoperability. And there's another resource called Interoperability Conversation Guide. And this is a conversation guide for the school systems and the EdTech service providers. So a conversation guide for both sides, the questions that could be asked to get to the information that's needed from both sides. So if you're sitting there and asking, how can you learn more? Because I know this is a pretty short webinar and we're almost finished. We're almost at the Q&A section. Well, Project Unicorn is here to help you. And one thing that you can do is sign our vendor pledge, which we will pop the link into the chat right now. This is a really quick form. It's about a few moments of your time. And what this pledge does is pledging your commitment to increase secure access, privacy, and interoperability in your products, and empower customers, educators, and families to achieve an enhanced level of engagement in their students' education, to improve the impact of educational data, and to inform teaching and learning practices for stronger student outcomes. Some of the benefits of signing up for the pledge: you'll join a community of like-minded EdTech vendors and school systems. You have access to the Project Unicorn online community. You will have a one-to-one technical assistance availability, calls, and referrals. There's also scholarships for conferences, professional learning to improve human capacity for interoperability, and you'll be the first to learn about new resources and upcoming events. So again, this takes only a moment of your time. If you are an EdTech vendor and you're sitting there and you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to fill this out right now. And one of the first things that you will receive when you fill it out is an email signed by Project Unicorn asking to set up a meeting so that we can learn more about your product and where you're at in your interoperability journey. Before we move to the Q&A section, 2 places that you can also turn to for help and for resources. The Project Unicorn Resource Library, we have a bunch of different resources, including the ones that we shared here today. You can type into the search bar vendor to get vendor-specific resources, or just check out all the different resources that we have available. We also have a YouTube channel, and this webinar will be posted on there if you want to go back to it, including multiple webinars from the past or any webinars in the future that you miss. They're all uploaded to our YouTube channel. So at this point, we are going to do our Q&A, and we're going to check out the chat as well as the Q&A box. If you have any questions that you have not popped into the question box, feel free to do that. But Susan and I will answer any questions that come in at this point.
And I just want to reiterate the fact that when you sign the Project Unicorn Pledge, all of our technical support and resources are free. So because we are grant funded and we are standards agnostics, we can focus on what would be the best solution for you, for your specific product based on your specific use case. So if we don't know the answer, we know people who do. So we are happy to talk with you, would encourage you to take up Chloe's suggestion and go ahead and sign the Project Unicorn Pledge. And in fact, I'm going to pop that link in the chat one more time, just in case you missed it. It's right there. All right, we have just a few moments for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I do have a question for you, Chloe, which would be, how would an EdTech vendor go about defining an interoperability use case?
That's a great question, Susan. So one way that you could go about defining the interoperability use case, and also just as Susan put the vendor pledge in the chat, you can have a conversation with us and we can get more specific to help you define this during our technical assistance calls. But definitely checking out the different resources, going back over the different slides that we send out. We'll send out these slides and figuring out which standard your product most aligns to. A commonly used first start for people who are asking, where should I start with interoperability, is rostering. Would you say that's correct, Susan, or anything to add to that?
Yes, I would say that rostering is very often the first step that EdTech vendors will go. And I'm looking up some resources for our follow-on question from Chris. Thank you so much for your question. Chris's question in the chat was, I understand the priority of working with the EdTech vendors, but would love an opportunity as a school district leader to engage further with this interoperability community. Woohoo! We are eager to talk with you, Chris. Specifically, we are looking for buying guides that would limit the acquisition of lesser systems that don't work well with interoperability. Well, we have in our library some sample RFP language, which may help get at your question. I have some sample RFP language from EdFi here, and let me go back. I think we have some from A4L as well. Yes, we do. We have some sample RFP language from A4L, which may help get at this point. And we do have, COSIN has a resource. I'm just going to go look this up right now while we're talking. So COSIN has, if you aren't familiar with it, if you go to cosin.org/interoperability, which is where I'm heading right now, they have an interoperability toolkit. They do have a, looking here, they have RFP guidelines. Okay, so this may be helpful as well. Basically, they ask things that school systems should look for when creating RFPs for a new classroom or enterprise management system. So I'm going to put this right here.
There was one question from John Matthews that said, do each of the standards, notably in the data exchange domain, include all of the data in the education domain? Example, special education data, behavioral data, etc.
That is an excellent question. And I would have to go back and look at the data dictionaries for each of the standards to see what data is included. If you do go to the websites, for instance, if you go to the CEDS website, which I think I posted in the chat above, they will list all of the elements in their data dictionary. And I'm pretty sure that A4L and the other standards bodies do the same thing. So that would be, I can't answer the question specifically as to whether they include all of the data in the education domain, but you could go to the individual standards bodies websites and take a look and see what data those individual standards include. And that's a really good question. Thank you for pointing that out. Another thing is that CEDS is P20 specific or P20 focused. So it's really focused on preschool through higher ed as well. And do we have any other questions in the chat besides that? Let me just.
Nope. I think the one last question, Susan, that we can end on is, how can implementing interoperability help me stand out in a crowded market?
Well, I'll be happy to take that one because definitely school systems that are looking for interoperability interoperable systems will rate it very highly. So there was a recent EdWeek, I believe, survey where I remember they said that when they surveyed educators talking about EdTech tools, and they were saying the number one most important thing for them was for EdTech tools to integrate with their learning management system. Another recent survey that was put out by AASA and the Data Quality Campaign found that 98% of school system superintendents want better and more access to data in order to make better informed educational decisions. So if you are responding, for instance, to an RFP that specifically requests an interoperability standard, then you're in luck, definitely. And more RFPs are requiring alignment with interoperability standards in their RFPs, and that's at both district levels and also at state levels. But if you are working and you are interoperable, and especially if you have one of the interoperability certifications, that is a sign to school systems that you take interoperability seriously. And that is becoming increasingly important to school systems because school systems want to do more with their data. There's a great hunger out there for them to be able to do more with their data. And actually, Chloe, I was just thinking, could you pop in the link to the Project Unicorn rubric in the chat, which is a great way for you to take a look at the rubric is used to evaluate vendors on where they stand with regard to different categories of data, whether that's data import or export, or how data is stored. And we are actually in the process of evaluating the Project Unicorn rubric right now. So there is going to be a version 2 that will be coming out soon, but you can see the current version of the rubric right now. And now, Chloe, I'm going to turn it back to you. I know that we are at time and you had a couple more things that you wanted to share.
Perfect. Yep. So I just popped a link in the chat for our next webinar, which is Tuesday, 1 week from today, December 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern. This is a webinar that is geared towards vendors again. So if you are an EdTech vendor, this is a great one to join. And the webinar is why data interoperability matters for EdTech startups. And we're doing this alongside Start Ed as a panel. Will be a great event and a great webinar. So please join us. And we want to thank you so much for coming today. And we hope to hear from you soon through our EdTech vendor pledge. Have a good one, everyone.